trying to get this all going. Okay, we're ready to start this webinar. This is a business and real estate webinar, and I'm Melissa Doherty Anderson. I'm an estate planner in Golden, Colorado, and I'm here today with Mike Ambroziak, who is a business and real estate attorney with over 22 years of experience. And Mike's specialty is he represents small business owners and also real estate investors in this space, and we're here today to talk a little bit about commercial leases. So without further ado, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Where did you want to start?
Well, you know, we were talking a little bit about where most businesses are beginning. So what's so interesting about what's going on with this recession right now is a lot of new businesses actually start up during a time of recession. You wouldn't think that that's the way it is, but a lot of small businesses start. And I think people really realize, oh, I maybe had this side gig going on and I've been laid off from my 9-to-5 job, but now I really want to start this new business that I've had this idea going on for a while. And people really don't understand necessarily what they need to do and all the facets they need to do in order to start a new business. So can you tell me a little bit about, leasing, commercial leasing, and what business owners might need to be aware of with leasing and maybe triple net lease?
Sure, yeah. And you're right. A lot of people have left their jobs and started new ones. I know a lot of people are making masks out of their homes, and that's not too different from how a lot of businesses start. First, they start working out of a garage or a home, and then at some point as they grow, they do need to find some space, whether it's industrial or office or what have you. And then that's when they start learning new terms like triple net leases. And that's one that throws people for a loop when they see these. What it means is that the landlord gets all of their revenue net of insurance, net of taxes, net of all operating costs. Essentially, that means that all the joys of ownership, all the costs of ownership fall on the tenants, and but they don't own. So it's they're pretty expensive leases, and then they're rather common, especially in industrial and in retail spaces. So people will run into these all the time. There are some other types of leases that you'll run into. Another very common one is called a full service gross, or just a gross lease. And that's a lease with sort of the opposite of the triple net, where you just have a monthly payment. It's kind of more similar to a residential lease. Except even utilities and cleaning and janitorial and all these sorts of things. You'll find this in certain office buildings where you just pay a flat rate for the month, and all your services and utilities are included, except maybe your phone. And then there are all sorts of hybrids out there, and a lot of people would call those a modified gross. And it might be the sort of thing where, like a gross lease, you have one main payment, but at the end of the month, or during the month, you also maybe pay a portion of common area maintenance expenses, or maybe you pick up some of your utilities. So there are a lot of hybrids in there, but the full service gross on one side and the triple net on the other side are mostly what people are going to see in a commercial leasing situation.
Mm-hmm. And if someone moves into a space where they start a lease, our landlords, what kinds of things can they negotiate with the landlord with respect to repairs and things like that? Will the landlord make certain changes, or?
Yeah, it's widely negotiated. A lot of new businesses, they see a space and they think, oh my God, it's not the right space. And, it could be, but we'd have to move these walls and do this and, renovate it or fix it. And so they pass, but quite often landlords will work with them and either abate rent for a period of time while the tenants improve the space or renovate it. And landlords are more likely to do that if the improvements actually benefit the building or enhance its value. And other times, if you can't get a rent abatement, landlords will actually pay for the renovations, and maybe the lease starts, and maybe there's sometimes it's a mix. Maybe you get a little bit of an abatement, and the landlord will also pay for some of the renovations. So I had one recently where the landlord agreed to put $180,000 into a space. Now there was a long-term commitment involved, and the rent was pretty high. But you can get some pretty substantial investments from landlords, and especially if it's a down market.
Mm-hmm. Which I'm assuming right now, with the whole pandemic and COVID, there is maybe a little bit more room to negotiate with landlords. And I am assuming that's what you're seeing a lot, is some back and forth negotiation with respect to rent and payments. And
I am. You know, the COVID thing is it's interesting because you know, a lot of businesses are hurting, but I'm not seeing them just terminate their leases and leave. What I'm seeing is a lot of people being very reasonable, being very cooperative, and trying to come to deals that work and that keep a tenant in a space and businesses afloat. You know, because if you're a commercial landlord right now, booting somebody out is you know, evicting them for non-payment, you might be having a hard time getting someone in there, and you're not necessarily improving your situation. So if you can work with your tenants and modify the situation so that everyone can kick the ball down the road a few months or longer, then you know, it's working out. I've seen some landlords just agree to abate rent during the pandemic until the restrictions are lifted. I've seen other people give tenants the option to terminate and agree on sort of a termination fee. You know, you can get creative depending on the situation, but I'm seeing a lot of cooperation out there, which is encouraging.
Yeah. And so what might be some of these mistakes that people make when leasing a space? Because if a landlord has said, okay, let's go ahead and allow you to terminate your agreement with me early, now he's got this open space and he's got room for a new business to come in. And that new business owner might, you know, what are the things that they need to be cautious about?
Right. So I think the number one mistake that a lot of businesses make when they get into a space is they don't get enough renewal options or any renewal options. You know, and you've probably seen this. I remember back in the Highlands, it was a thing when rents started going up and businesses were going belly up because they didn't have renewal options, and they had to leave a very lucrative location.
And it might be something that they had fixed up and they had put a lot of time and effort into. They had already built their clientele. And then the Highlands landlord said, oh, listen, I can, you know, I've already had 4 or 5 different companies in here saying they want to develop this space and build a high rise, so I can get more money for it than allowing you to stay in the space.
Right.
They booted the business owners out.
Yeah, and you know, and your leverage for that is when you're negotiating your first lease. You know, once you're in the space, it's kind of hard to negotiate for some renewal options after the fact because most tenants don't have a lot of leverage in that situation. Mm-hmm. And commercial landlords will typically do at a minimum, say, a 3-year plus a 3-year renewal. You'll see 5 plus 5. You know, when you do like franchises, like you know, Taco Bell's, KFC's, these kinds of things, you'll quite often see 4 or 5-year renewals. So your lease terms that can, at the option of the tenant, be in excess of 20 years. I've actually seen a few that were 50. Those are unusual, but you know, in the small business sector, you're looking at a 3-year plus 3-year option or 5 or plus 5-year option. That range is pretty common, and that can give you a lot of comfort to grow and a lot of time to plan if you need to leave.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is an FMV? I've heard that term.
Oh, fair market value. So so related to the option, when you know, the question is, well, what is the rent in the renewal term? And ideally, you want to nail that down. Now, that can be hard to foresee the future, and sometimes people just want to punt and say fair market value. The lease will be whatever the fair market value is. But unfortunately, that sets people up for arguments down the road, and then if they can't agree on it, depending on how the lease is drafted, you might find yourself out of a lease anyway. Or an illegal dispute, and you know, there are ways to draft around that and put some procedure around it. But frankly, it's a lot easier to just agree to some sort of rent ahead of a time, or an escalator, some sort of methodology for escalating the rents, like
Right.
referring to the consumer price index and then pegging your increases to that. That's, something like that is a little more objective and provides a little protection and a little foreseeability for both sides.
I assume that's really good, especially in areas of town that maybe weren't as desirable previously, and then they become gentrified, and then wow, these rents will go up. Rhino, Highlands, things like that. I mean, you see that in a lot of different areas.
Exactly. So if you're pegging to fair market value, once you determine that, and oftentimes that involves appraisals and things like that, the tenants can be priced out. But if it raised the CPI, they wouldn't, right? On the other hand, the landlord who has a 3% increase locked in, if it's a down market, there's some protection on the downside for them as well. So, there's pros and cons on both sides.
Yeah. Something good for even landlords to really look at as
Absolutely.
well. Especially in a time of recession, like what we're going into now.
Right.
That would affect them on the downturn.
Yeah, which started in February, apparently, some of the numbers are telling us. And that was before the pandemic really got rolling. But it's going to be an interesting market.
Sure is. And so when business is falling, how can a tenant get out of a lease? Because I think that's kind of the question that a lot of small business owners are having right now.
Yeah. So, one of the problems with from the tenant side and most commercial leases is that, and especially the triple nets, they almost always come with personal guarantees. So, even if the business went bankrupt, let's say, the owners of the business typically have signed a personal guarantee to get into that space. And so they can be sued personally, and your house, car, your toys are all on the line. And so, this is, unfortunately, you can't get around this in certain situations. Sometimes people can, and especially with smaller landlords, institutional landlords in triple net space, investment funds, REITs, things like these that own large buildings, that they're more difficult to negotiate with. But privately held property with local owners, sometimes you can give them a bigger deposit and avoid a personal guarantee. Sometimes they'll allow the guarantee to drop off after some period of time, maybe a year or two, as long as rent payments have been made consistently during that time. So there's some things you can do up front to hopefully minimize your exposure. Yeah, and then on the back side, when a business has to terminate a lease, there are a few things that come into play. In the COVID environment, there's a clause, a boilerplate clause that starts to become a little more important that nobody typically thinks about much. It's called the force majeure clause. And what that is, also known as an act of God clause. It's sort of clauses that say, that people will not be liable for performance under their contracts when certain things happen that are completely out of their control, like riots, disasters, these sorts of things.
Pandemics.
Yeah, global pandemics, yeah.
Hurricanes. There's a lot of things, right? Earthquakes, hurricanes, and it's an act of God.
Right, and people argue about, what sort of things are force majeure. Is a union riot a force majeure? Is a difficulty in the supply chain of force majeure? And these things can be debated, and you can draft around them. But I think a global pandemic quite clearly falls in that category. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's off the hook. All it means is that to the extent that they're prevented from performing, there is some legal relief there. And so, so this is in the mix, and it's another reason for people to be a little more reasonable. But let's say a tenant does terminate a lease. There's some considerations on both sides. On one hand, the tenants and or the personal guarantors will be on the hook for the lost rent during the term of the lease, right? So if the lease is for another year, they could be exposed potentially for the unpaid rent for that entire year. Now, that's not normally typically how it pans out, though, because at least in the Front Range, it's a pretty healthy market, and landlords can typically find new tenants, and they have a legal duty to do that. They have to mitigate their damages. And what that requires a landlord to do is to take reasonable measures to go out and try to release the space. So they got to, they got to get it cleaned up. They got to advertise it, put it on the market, and they can't just sit back and not do anything. Otherwise, a landlord in that situation will be, they won't be able to go after the tenant when they have unclean hands, in a sense, because they haven't tried to mitigate the damages. But because of those things, quite often tenants are only really, when in the worst case scenario where they're getting out, in the most recent markets, they're typically not liable for more than 1 or 2 or a handful of months, depending on how hard the space is to release. So there are some sort of natural limits there, even though technically they could be on the hook for years of unpaid rent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, it's really interesting with what's going on right now with respect to the forecast. What are you seeing, happening? What are you forecasting in the future going on with commercial real estate and commercial space? Everyone's working from home. Everyone's doing things virtually. So people are starting to make guesses of, are large commercial spaces going to be able to remain filled, or are companies going to say, listen, maybe we can work from home? What about the small company? I mean, what are your thoughts on all of that?
I have absolutely no idea what the future holds, but
Right.
I'm curious, I hear things on different sides. On one hand, you hear a lot of people saying, wow, we have all this real estate that we're putting our employees in, and we're getting just as much work done when they're at home, and we're saving a lot of money, and maybe we should do this in the future. I think there are going to be a lot of situations like that, and companies are going to rethink how much real estate they need. Then on the other hand, I've heard some commercial brokers say that they don't think there's going to be any impact on large office buildings. And so people have different views of it. What the market will morph into, we'll have to wait and see. It's not going to be the same, though, for sure. And I think there's a lot of people there's some people who like working at home and may continue to do that, or spend less time in the office. I think a lot of people are missing being around other humans and socializing. Yeah. And I know you're looking forward to getting back to Connect's workspace, and
I am, yeah. Both of us work out of the same Connect's workspace, which is it's a unique idea, and I think something that will really thrive perhaps during this type of economy, where you can go in and you can use an office, you can rent a conference room, but you could work from home if you want. So it gives people flexibility, and I think if people have a large commercial space that opens up and they're wanting to know what they might do with it, it's a good option for them. But I certainly think corporate culture is something that's sought after, and perhaps the larger businesses really will think that that's a value added to be able to have that networking and corporate culture. People going into the office, having chats, being able to walk down the hall and ask questions of their colleagues. Those are all, are they quantifiable? Is it worth the money to be spent? And some would argue yes, especially in the larger organizations.
Yeah, I think for sure there's going to be a lot of property changing hands, though. Between the inevitable evictions and bankruptcies and whatnot, and I think a lot of these things are kind of getting pent up. They're building right now, and with some of the laws coming online, postponing eviction rights and things like that. That's going to help delay things, but eventually there's going to be a flood of bankruptcies. There's going to be a flood of evictions, and you're going to hear a lot of rough stories. But for every one of those stories, there's another one regarding a business that just started up, and one that's growing, and ones that's expanding during the pandemic. Zoom communications is doing great in this environment for obvious reasons, but and others are hurting. But so I think there's going to be a big reshuffling.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think the evictions waive, certainly I'm part of the Colorado Bar Association, and the listserv on there, you know, I look at it daily, and there has already been quite a bit of talk about evictions and bankruptcies coming up, and attorneys are already starting to ask questions. The CARES Act is one thing, you know, that people have been talking about with respect to what the governor had signed and the moratorium on evictions. Federally backed loans, those kind of things. I know you had just recently looked that up, the information on that. But though this isn't legal advice necessarily to give to anyone, and I do want to make that disclaimer, that our conversation that you and I are having today, Mike, is more of, we're talking about general broad law. If anyone is watching this, they should seek their own attorney to get particular advice on their specific situation. But this is just, you know, the state of what's going on right now. We have, you know, our governor is trying to make the best calls and the best decisions he can. And that certainly is, you know, putting that moratorium on evictions for the meanwhile, but they will certainly come. So.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting time.
It sure is. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and talking a little bit with me about this. Is just fascinating, and I think a really timely and pertinent topic. So if someone wants to get in touch with you, how can they do so, Mike?
They can find all my contact info on my website, which is ambroziaklaw.com. My last name spelled AMBROZIAKLAW.com.
And are you meeting with clients virtually right now too?
I am, yes. I rarely did video conferences before the pandemic, but now everybody's doing it, and some of my clients, frankly, are a little, and maybe some of the older ones who are being a little more cautious and staying at home. I sense a little more desire to get on a conference call and look somebody in the eye and, you know, have some semblance of human interaction. So yeah, it's been interesting. I think that's one thing that's going to change too, is it's going to be like the new normal, right?
Yeah.
Video conferencing will be very common. I mean, we were talking about our kids before the call, sitting around on conference calls, and, you know, it was a funny thing to come down, have my kid come down in the morning, and the 12-year-old say, "Oh my gosh, I got to get on a conference call."
Yeah.
I told my kids they're ready for corporate America, you know.
I know. My son was the same way. We were joking because he's like a little businessman every day, getting on with his teacher, and, you know, they would put up their backgrounds and they knew all the little features, and yeah, it is very interesting. And I've been doing the same thing. I primarily draft wills and power of attorney documents. I also do some estate administration as well, and I've had a fair amount of virtual will signings. The governor has allowed that to go on, and virtual notarizations right now. We've got those through the end of the month. They've extended them. Every month, the governor keeps extending them. So we'll see how long that will go on for. But a lot of my clients are older. They don't necessarily want to get together with masks on and hand sanitizer in order to sign their will. They'd rather do it virtually right now. And then if we need to, we can go ahead and re-notarize later on. But you know, it has been a good thing that we have the technology right now to take care of this. And I think slowly, as people start to go back to a new normal, depending on what happens with this whole pandemic, we'll start to be able to meet in person more and more. But at least we have that option to do the virtual as well.
Yeah, are there special rules around the virtual notarizations? How does that work?
There are, you know, wills, it's very interesting. They've given us one special rule for the will, which is you still need to have that wet ink signature. And that is coming up also in bankruptcy. They're doing virtual bankruptcies now too, but on the final document, I still have to have my client sign it with a pen and either send it to me, or what we've done is drop it off at one another's house or put it in the mail. And then I notarize and affix my stamp to that final wet ink signature page. Everything else we can do virtually. It's that final bit of the will. Same with the bankruptcy pages. Power of attorney, all the other documents can be done virtually. We just DocuSign them.
Do they hold their ID up to the camera?
They do. They hold their ID up to the camera. I've also had people do that, and then they text me a picture of their ID. So then I
Okay.
have a copy of that, and then I'll keep that in the file. I
Do you
think
re-
that's nice because I can see it more clearly.
Are you recording your sessions?
We're recording the sessions, and then I keep them on a cloud. So, I'll have that recording forever, if you will.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And that
It
used to
is.
be a special thing. You would go out of your way to record something. For instance, if there were competence issues and someone's competence to sign a will might have been challenged later, people would
Correct.
record it. But
Right.
now it's just common practice because it's so easy, right?
Yeah. The other really interesting thing is that the testator, the person who's signing the will, really needs to be in the actual physical presence of two witnesses. Well, so if we're all on a Zoom call, are we really in actual physical presence? I've had a couple of these remote notarizations where my clients will have two neighbors be the witnesses. So literally you can walk over and say, can you see me signing the will through the window? And they're in actual physical presence. So then we know that really that has, we've jumped that hurdle. Is this actual physical presence being on a Zoom call? It feels like it is.
Well,
Because we feel like we're in the same room, but in any
I guess
event,
a court will decide that for us down the road and let us know.
yeah, hopefully all of these are fine, because the way that the Secretary of State and the Colorado Bar Association Trust and Estates Committee put these notarization rules together specifically for wills, tried to cover all the bases. So we're doing what we can at this moment, but hopefully we don't have any issues with them. I think mine are pretty airtight because I had the people say, well, I'm right here. I'm literally through a window and you can see it. So there really wouldn't be a question, but yeah. So, it's interesting with the state of business right now, doing everything virtually, but I appreciate everyone for watching this today. Hopefully Mike gave some good advice out to our viewers. I know we have a couple of local business owners that are watching this, and we can also share the link on demand to anyone. So, if anyone watching this wants to give this to another friend or share this, we can always share this on demand as well. And thank you today for joining me, Mike. I appreciate all your insight.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. And I'll say that if anyone watching has a follow-up question on anything they've heard, I'm happy to take a call. So.
Oh, sounds good. Yeah, and for me as well, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm at www.coloradoestateplanner.com. My name is Melissa Doherty Anderson, and thank you so much, Mike Ambroziak. Appreciate all your time today.
Okay. Thanks, Melissa.
All right, take care. Thanks.
Bye.